It is time for March birthday shoutouts. Not to make your birth month all about me, but March is the month I became a mom. My oldest is about to turn 25. It's kind of wild how my own age doesn't make me feel old, but when I say his age, it does. Even though I was on the younger side when he was born, it definitely dates me a bit that I have a 25-year-old as of the end of this month. But I'll tell him happy birthday in person. Let me get to my March Patreon birthday shoutouts. I want to say a very happy birthday to Zoe, Anita, Julian, who is having a big birthday this year, Kathleen, Yasi, Lorena, Madeline, Alex, and Pam. I hope this next trip around the sun is your brightest yet, filled with love and happiness and plenty of birthday cake. So to all of my March Patreon birthdays, happy birthday. Latrese Curtis told her husband that she was going to the library to study, but instead went to another man's house. What happened after that exposed more secrets than anyone had anticipated. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome back if you've listened before. I just want to give a quick reminder that in the show notes, you can find information on events I'm going to be at. This year, I will be at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Denver, which is in July, and the Berkshire Podcast Festival in October in North Adams, Massachusetts. As it stands, I think those are the only two events I'm going to be doing this year, and the links for tickets are in the show notes. I do want to point out that the Berkshire Festival has an amazing pre-sale pricing going on right now. So if you get those tickets before April 1st, you can take advantage of the low price. Before we start the episode, I do want to give a quick content warning. I don't usually do these because you listen to my show, you generally know what it's about. But when I talk about things I don't normally talk about or in details I don't normally talk about, I do like to give a content warning. There will be the mention of sexual abuse of teens in this episode and a bit more candid discussion on sex than I usually have to have in my episodes. If you listen with your teen, maybe have a quick listen first to see if this episode is appropriate. Let's go ahead and get started with today's episode, which is about Latrese Jones Curtis, who grew up in North Carolina. After finishing high school, she attended an all-female HBCU in Greensboro called Bennett College. Latrese had been such a daddy's girl growing up that her dad told the show When Murder Lies that he cried like a baby when they dropped her off at college. But for whatever reason, the school wasn't really the right fit for Latrese, so she transferred to Wake County Tech. Now, that school is just a 2-year community college, so she was only there for about another year before it was time to move on to pursue her 4-year degree at North Carolina Central University, which is located in Durham. She was majoring in accounting, and she was looking forward to graduating and getting her career started. She was a very goals-oriented person. Latrese was at NCCU for less than a year when she showed up at work one day with a ring on her finger. This would have been in April of 2007. She had been dating another student named Darren Curtis, and without any fanfare and without many people knowing, they eloped when she was a month shy of turning 21. Her family didn't really know Darren that well at that point, and they were hurt that Latrese hadn't talked to them first. Her father, a little old-fashioned, told When Murder Lies that it also bothered him that Darren didn't come to him to let him know that he intended to marry Latrese or to ask for her hand or anything like that. But the two were in love and moved into an apartment in Raleigh. They were both juggling school and work, and according to neighbors, they never heard fighting from the apartment, but neither seemed particularly happy when they saw them. They certainly didn't come across as newlyweds to them. That could just be because they didn't have a lot of time together since they were both so busy. Latrese worked in the HR department at a local Sears about 15 minutes from their apartment, but she had to drive 45 minutes each way to get to and from classes. Darren's schedule was pretty similar. They both woke up early to go to school and or work, and then they often had to study or attend school events late into the evening hours. Tuesday, January 29th, 2008, 9 months into their marriage, looked like it was going to be another day of not really seeing each other. 21-year-old Latrese had the day off of work, but she had a full day of classes. She left the house around 7:15 in the morning, shortly before Darren headed out to work himself. Around 5 p.m., Darren called Latrese and said that he needed to be at a meeting around 7, so he wasn't going to drive all the way home in between. And that was fine with her because she was going to the library to study after class anyway. Darren attended his meeting, and at 8:30, he drove home. When he got there, Latrese wasn't back yet, but he didn't really expect her to be. Around 10, Latrese called and said she was heading home from the library and asked if Darren had eaten yet. He said he had, so she said she was just going to stop and grab something to eat for herself on her way home. When Darren went to bed around 11:30, he had expected Latrese would have made it home by then, but it wasn't alarming to him that she wasn't there. He thought maybe when she said she was getting food on the way home, she meant that she was stopping at her parents' house. And that is such a college kid way to think, isn't it? Grabbing food could mean a drive-thru, but it could also mean raiding mom and dad's pantry. If Latrese did stop at her parents' house, it would take her longer because she would be visiting with them and chatting. So since he had to get up at 6:30 in the morning, Darren decided not to wait up any longer and headed to bed. His alarm went off as planned at 6:30, and the first thing he noticed was that Latrese wasn't in bed next to him like he expected. It looked like she hadn't come home at all the night before. He called her cell phone and it went to voicemail. He decided to go ahead and get ready for work. If Latrese had stopped at her parents' house, maybe she spent the night there if it was getting late. He figured he'd just call her again when he got to work. Darren left around 7:15 or 7:30 as usual. As he drove to work, he noticed a white car pulled over on the highway, but he didn't really think much of it. He then ended up stuck in traffic for what he assumed was a car crash. When he got to the scene of where all the traffic was stopped, he saw that there was a blue tarp in the grass, which he assumed correctly was covering a body. As Darren kept going down the road, things started processing. Latrese hadn't come home the night before, and she drove a white car like the one he saw pulled over. Darren decided to get off the highway and head back home to start calling around looking for Latrese. He called her cell phone again and got no answer, so he called her brother and her father, neither of whom had seen or heard from Latrese. He thought the next most likely explanation would be that Latrese was at the hospital with a friend who he knew was pregnant. If this friend had gone into labor, Latrese would not hesitate to drop everything to be there for her. The problem was Darren didn't have that friend's number, so he powered up an old cell phone of Latrese's to try to get the number off of her contact list, but it wasn't there. So he decided not to wait any longer, and he called the police to report her missing at 8:30 in the morning. After that, Darren thought he could check their cell phone records online to find the friend's number, and maybe he would see who else Latrese was calling the night before. Maybe that would help him figure out where she went. So he pulled those up online at about 8:50, and he saw a bunch of calls to a number he didn't recognize. All of these calls were from the night before, and some of them were just a couple of minutes long. So Darren dialed the number. The phone belonged to Stephen Randolph. According to Darren, Stephen answered, and Darren asked him how he knew Latrese. Stephen didn't answer that, but rather asked if Latrese was okay. Darren didn't know if she was okay. He didn't know where she was, so he hung up and called the state troopers. He asked if there had been a wreck or something involving Latrese, but they didn't have anything on record. Still unable to shake the blue tarp and the white car, Darren drove back out to the scene and pulled over next to the car. He looked closer at it and realized it was, in fact, Latrese's. He opened it up and noticed that the center console was broken, and he saw that there was blood on the driver's side, both on the seat and the door. So he closed the door, he got a picture of Latrese from his car, and he walked over to where the police were. They stopped him from getting too close, but he showed them the picture and said his wife was missing and her car was down the highway, and he just wanted them to tell him that it wasn't her under that tarp. Unfortunately, they couldn't tell him that. The officer saw the picture and redirected Darren to a detective who had him sit in a patrol car. It was chilly and damp, raining on and off that morning, so this was for his comfort. He was not in any way being detained. They did ask Darren if he was willing to go to the station to answer some more questions, which he was more than willing to do. He told them the movements of him and Latrese from the day before leading up to when her body was found. And this helped fill in a few things for investigators a bit, but there was still a big gap in the timeline. Darren last spoke to Latrese at 10 p.m. the night before. He didn't know where on the path from the college to their apartment she was, but he knew she was definitely in the car because he could hear the radio playing. Then around 7:15 in the morning, motorists started calling 911 to report a body near an exit sign on I-540. But between those 2 points on the timeline was a major question mark. What they did know from the scene was that Latrese hadn't been in a wreck and she hadn't been hit by a car. She had been stabbed, according to the autopsy, around 40 times, and she was dragged to where she was found. Her attacker may have been trying to get her into the woods, but didn't make it that far from the highway before just leaving her. Latrese had been dead for hours by the time she was found, and people had been driving by her body all that time, but because of how far it was from the road, no one actually saw her until the sun came up. The police also learned something else on autopsy, which was held back initially. When her body was found, there was a condom inside her vagina, and her pants were unbuttoned. They couldn't tell at that point if the sex had been consensual or not. There were also 2 pieces of duct tape found along the side of the highway. There weren't signs that Latrese's hands or feet had been bound, but perhaps this was a failed attempt at trying to bind her. Being the husband, obviously Darren was a person of interest, and they photographed his hands, his arms, his legs, as well as his bare chest, but he didn't have any marks on him. The investigators found Darren to be credible, even though his alibi was that he was home alone sleeping. It was really his responses to the questions and his consistency in telling his story that made them believe him. Latrese's family, however, did not rule him out quite so easily. Her father said on that interview with When Murder Lies that I mentioned earlier that Darren did not reach out to them to talk to them or to tell them what was going on. They found out what happened to Latrese when they started making their own calls, and they found that disrespectful. Beyond that, Latrese's father didn't understand how Darren went to bed when Latrese wasn't home. If it was him and his wife called at 10 saying that she was on her way home, but she hadn't made it there by 11:30, he would be out looking for her. Just shrugging and going to bed just didn't make sense to him. But what Latrese's family didn't know was that in the afternoon of that first day of the investigation, the investigators were given a different person to look into. While a lot of the 911 calls coming in that morning went to the Wake County Sheriff, some people called the State Highway Patrol to report a body on the side of the road. After the Highway Patrol confirmed that the Sheriff's Department was handling the case, one investigator with the Highway Patrol had an idea. She went back through the Highway Patrol's call logs from that night to see if there were any notes of suspicious activity in the area, and they found something pretty big. Around 1:30 in the morning, a trooper driving down I-540 saw a minivan on the side of the road. The hazards were flashing, so he pulled over behind it to see if he could help. When he approached the driver's side, he realized no one was in the car. He walked to the front to see if there was any front end damage, like if the driver had hit a deer or something. There was no damage, so he looked back in the driver's side. he realized that the window was rolled halfway down, which stood out since it had been raining on and off that night. In fact, the windshield wipers were going. So it was raining hard enough to leave the wipers on, so why have the window open? The trooper realized the door was unlocked, and when he opened it, the car started dinging because the keys were still in the ignition. Suspecting the vehicle may have been stolen and dumped, he called in the license plate. It came back to a man named Robert Reeves who lived in Durham, and it had not, at least not to that point, been reported stolen. It still seemed strange, so the trooper sent a message to another trooper asking if he would leave his own vehicle on the side of the highway with the window rolled down, the door unlocked, and the key in the ignition. In the end, though, there was really nothing he could do about it except report an abandoned vehicle on the highway. He cleared the scene at 1:53 a.m., having not seen anyone, and then he headed out on another call. The trooper had seen a white car on the opposite side of the highway, but he did not run that plate. It's believed, though, that may have been Latrese's car. A few hours later, around 5:15 a.m., so while it was still dark, the same trooper passed the area again, but the minivan was gone. The minivan had been seen near where Latrese's body had been found, so obviously the police wanted to speak with the owner, Robert Reeves. There is one report saying that they spoke to him that day or the next, but most reporting said that they spoke to him 2 days later on February 1st. But it wasn't just Robert they talked to, they also spoke with his roommate, who was Stephen Randolph, the same man whose phone number showed up on Latrese's phone records. Stephen actually came forward himself. He attended school with Latrese and heard from a teacher that a student, Latrese Curtis, had died. He was very upset, so he left class and went home. When he told his roommate Robert about it, Robert said that he actually recorded the news from the other night on his TiVo, and they had talked about the incident on there. After Stephen watched the segment, he was still pretty upset, maybe even more upset, and he needed to talk to someone. So he went to the school counselor, and then he was directed to the campus police, who then directed him to the sheriff's department. Stephen told them that he knew where Latrese was the night before she died. She wasn't at the library like she told her husband. She was with him. Latrese and Stephen had met several months before in the fall of 2007 at NCCU. He was a basketball player and a student hoping to make it to the NBA. And Stephen initially told the police that he and Latrese were just friends. But he finally admitted that they had slept together 2 or 3 times, including on the night before she was found dead. Stephen and Latrese had spent most of the last few months just as friends who hung out sometimes. This wasn't a consistent romantic relationship or an ongoing affair. And though Stephen knew she was married, he thought that Darren and Latrese were separated the first time they slept together. Though Latrese told her husband she was heading to the library when she was done with classes on January 29th, she actually went to Stephen's house. She got there around 7:30 or 8, and she called him from outside to come open the door and let her in. Stephen said they were just hanging out in his room, and they did end up having sex, but it sounds like it wasn't planned. Afterwards, they realized that the condom Stephen was wearing had come off, and it was inside of Latrese. She was having trouble getting it out and wasn't really sure what to do about it, particularly as she was about to go home to her husband. Eventually, without being able to get it out, she decided to just head home. Stephen walked her to her car, and according to him, he asked her to text when she made it back to her apartment. She had a 40-minute drive home, and it was late, so he wanted to make sure she got back safely. Stephen then got into his own car and drove over to his girlfriend Velma's house to hang out with her and some friends. Stephen had gotten to Velma's house a little after 10. After he was there for a while, he realized that Latrese hadn't texted to let him know that she got home safely, so he texted and just asked if she was okay. This was around 11 p.m. She texted back that she was fine. About an hour later, Latrese called Stephen 3 times at 12:05, 12:06, and 12:20. Based on the pings from the cell tower, all of these calls were made from Latrese's phone near where her body was found. We do not know where Stephen's phone was at the time because those pings were not requested, and we'll get into that later. Stephen told the police that Latrese wanted to talk to him about their relationship on the 12:06 call. She told him she wanted to be more than friends, and she wanted to know if he felt the same way. He told her that she still had a husband she had to deal with before they could move ahead with anything, and that he'd rather talk to her about it face to face. Stephen then hung up the phone with her and went back to hanging out with his friends. Then Latrese called him again at 12:20, but when he answered, no one was there. He said he left Velma's house by about 1:20 or 1:25, which would put him home by 1:30. He told the police he then armed the home alarm system and went to bed. Not only is his timeline backed up by a friend who left the same time Stephen did, it was backed up by the alarm system. Someone armed it at 1:28 a.m., like Stephen said he had done. Stephen said when he woke up for class in the morning, he saw that Latrese had called him around 2 a.m., but he didn't hear it because he was asleep, and she didn't leave a voicemail. It would turn out that Stephen wasn't the only one Latrese called around 2 a.m., or someone with her phone made these calls. Latrese had been playing phone tag with her friend Kimberly that day, and at around 2 a.m., Kimberly woke up to her phone ringing. She answered it, but no one was there. She could hear what sounded like someone walking along gravel, and she said, "Latrese? Latrese?" a couple of times. She eventually hung up, assuming Latrese hadn't meant to call her, but she was also not sure what she was hearing. Why was Latrese walking along gravel at 2 a.m. on a weeknight? So while there wasn't anything super urgent like hearing screams, it also left her feeling uneasy. But back to Stephen. He said he was on campus when Darren called him asking about Latrese. He had never talked to Darren before, but he knew this was Latrese's husband because he introduced himself as Darren Curtis, which meant that Stephen was being careful in what he said. Stephen said that Darren mentioned that Latrese hadn't come home, and that was a bit of a red flag for him. He didn't know how Darren even got his phone number, and he figured Latrese may be in some trouble with her husband, so he decided he was just going to lay low and not call her for the next couple of days and just wait for her to make contact with him. To the investigators, it did seem awfully coincidental that the minivan seen near the crime scene belonged to the roommate of someone Latrese was having an affair with. So Stephen ended up a bit higher than Darren on the person of interest list. But Stephen didn't own the minivan, so the investigators also spoke with the owner of it, 43-year-old pastor Robert Reeves. It would help the case move forward if he could put the keys to the vehicle in Stephen's hand. Robert told the police that on January 29th, he had been at church from around 8 p.m. until 11 or 11:30. And after that, he was in for the night. He had no idea how his vehicle was seen at 1:30 in the morning along the highway. He confirmed that Stephen did have spare keys to the minivan, and he had used it before when his own car was being repaired. Robert didn't give Stephen permission to take it that night, but he wouldn't have really needed to ask. If Robert was asleep and Stephen needed to use it, he could just use it. Robert did let the police know that Latrese and Stephen were in a sexual relationship and that it was a relationship Latrese wanted to be more serious than it was. He also told the police that he had found a gun under Stephen's pillow at one point and that Stephen had a knife collection. Like the investigators had done with Latrese's husband Darren, they asked to check Stephen and Robert for any injuries. Their arms, hands, legs, and bare chests were photographed, and Stephen had nothing of note. Robert had, however, what is described as a gouge on his right hand, as well as an abrasion on his right leg below the knee, almost like he kneeled down on something rough. These injuries were not well healed and they looked pretty new. Robert said they were from when he and Stephen had moved a desk up from the basement, but Stephen said Robert hadn't gotten injured when they moved it. Those marks and the fact that his van was at the crime scene were enough for Robert's name to get added to the person of interest list alongside Darren and Stephen. More of an investigation would need to be done into all three men and their movements. Darren's alibi was that he was sleeping, which is hard to prove. But what were the odds that Robert Reeves' minivan was near the crime scene for some unrelated reason? Slim to none, and that effectively ruled Darren out. They were looking at anyone who had access to that minivan. As far as Stephen and Robert went, Stephen had a pretty good alibi. He said he was at a friend's house until he got home around 1:30, and the alarm system backed up that someone had armed the alarm at 1:28. The minivan was then seen by the trooper at 1:36. So how could Stephen have come home, armed the alarm before leaving again, and then make it somehow 25 miles to the crime scene in just 8 minutes? Highly unlikely he could do that. Now, it is possible Stephen wasn't the one who armed the alarm at 1:28, but then how would he have known it was armed around 1:30 if he wasn't the one who did it and he was 25 miles away? So we then have to look at Robert's movements and try to confirm those. Like Darren, he said he was home at the time, but unlike Darren, there was someone else in the house. Robert's sister, Willa Mae, was renting one of the rooms from him. When she talked to the police, she said she came home from church around 8:45 or 9 p.m., and Stephen and Latrese were there, but her brother Robert was not. She went up to her room to watch some television before going to bed. She heard Stephen and Latrese leave, but then she didn't hear anything else. She said she went to bed around 12 or 12:30, which, if this was accurate, then Robert was incorrect on the time he got home, which he said was 11 or 11:30. With the layout of the house, it would have been very unlikely that someone came in without Willa Mae hearing. But maybe he got home a little later than he said, and maybe Willa Mae fell asleep a little earlier than she thought, and they really did just miss each other. The only guaranteed accurate keeper of time we have in this case is that alarm system. When Stephen came home at 1:28, he didn't have to disarm the alarm, so if Willa Mae and Robert were both home and asleep, neither one thought to set it before bed. Stephen then armed it and went to bed himself. Then at 2:30 in the morning, someone triggered the alarm. This was an hour after the trooper had seen the minivan. Whoever set off the alarm disarmed it 4 seconds later, and we know who did it. While anyone can arm an alarm system, disarming it requires a code, obviously. Well, this system had multiple codes for the occupants of the house, and the only person who knew the master code was Robert Reeves. The disarming of the alarm at about 2:30 was done using that master code. Robert said he was home all night, so why was he needing to disarm the alarm that Stephen had set? Due to his injuries and statements to the police, plus his vehicle being at the crime scene, plus the records from the alarm system, on February 2nd, 2008, Robert Reeves was arrested and charged with Latrese's murder. So Robert Reeves had managed to make it to the top of the suspect list, but what in the world could his motive have been? He had met Latrese maybe 2 times ever, and he had no connection to her. The motive wasn't obvious to the investigators, and it would take an extensive look at Robert's background for them to come up with something. So let's go ahead and talk about Robert Reeves and how the police came to their conclusion of his possible motive in this murder. Robert had grown up an ambitious young man and a religious one. He became a Baptist minister in the 1980s, and while attending college, he was the pastor of a small church in South Carolina. He was there for a number of years. And this is where that content warning from the top about sexual assault and abuse is going to kick in. In 1987, Robert left the church after he was arrested and charged with a sex offense. after a 14-year-old boy accused Robert of sodomizing him at knife point. According to a 2002 Newsday article called Sounding Alarm, Robert pleaded guilty to third-degree sexual assault in early 1988. He was sentenced to 7 years behind bars, of which he served about 3.5, being paroled in 1991. Much of the information on what Robert did next comes from that same Newsday article, which is in my sources. After his release from prison, Robert was ordered to continue counseling for sex offenders, which he did not do. Instead, he moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he had family, and he tried to start over with a clean slate. There were no sex offender registries at the time, so moving from South Carolina to New York definitely kept a lot of people from knowing about his history. In 1994, however, South Carolina figured out that Robert hadn't been complying with his parole conditions, and he was arrested and extradited back. In the end, though, he was just charged with a fine, and he was allowed to return to New York. According to Newsday, Robert got married and had 2 children. In 1996, he returned to preaching at a small Baptist church called Cedar of Lebanon in New York. But the good times were not to last. His wife learned about his past conviction in 1999, and horrified as anyone would be, she packed up the kids and filed for divorce. The divorce was a contentious one, and Robert was not coping well. He was arrested twice the following year, in June for petty larceny after he stole luggage from a department store, and again in August when he threatened and assaulted a man. Robert pleaded down on both charges, but Cedar of Lebanon was not pleased. They wrote him a letter in October of 2000 telling him that he had embarrassed the church, and they asked him to resign. He resisted, so they had to get an attorney involved to basically push him out. Robert then decided to start his own church just 3 blocks down the road in January of 2002, and he named it Cedar International Fellowship, and he took some of the congregation with him. It was in May of 2002 that things sort of blew up on Robert. While his divorce was dragging on, Newsday had been alerted that he was talking about setting up a daycare center at the church. Robert denied it when he was called for comment, but multiple church members were aware that this was his plan, though it never would have gotten off the ground. New York would have run a background check on him, and they would have denied any application immediately if it had even gotten that far. But it didn't, because some people who heard about the daycare plans went to the media with their accusations against Robert. Accusations of impropriety with teenagers. About 6 boys ages 13 to 19 reported that Robert would make sexually suggestive comments to them, including asking if they'd ever work for a male escort service and inviting them over to compare and measure the size of their penises. It's unclear if any young men went to Robert's house, but none went to the police to report a crime at the time. Robert did tell Newsday that the rumors and accusations were false and insinuated that they were an attempt to smear him ahead of his divorce. But I want you to keep in mind some of the specific accusations against him because they're going to come back up. Though Robert denied it, the accusations were enough to have him pack up again and move back down to South Carolina, where in July of 2002 he was arrested again. According to a 17-year-old boy, a man in a car pulled alongside him and asked him if he needed a job. The boy said yes and got into Robert's car. Robert then started talking to him about sex and allegedly put his hand down the young man's pants. The teen managed to get himself out of the car and noted the plate number. He called and reported the sexual assault to the police, and the car was traced back to Robert Reeves. Robert was 37 years old at that point and charged with assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct. It's not clear exactly what happened in this case, except it didn't end in a conviction, and it looks like the charges were dropped at some point. Robert then packed up and left again, this time settling in North Carolina. From July 2006 until January of 2007, Robert worked as a clinical research associate for a company. He was fired for making nearly $6,500 in unauthorized purchases with the company credit card. They fired him, but they did not press criminal charges. They just wanted their money back, so they sued Robert, who was ordered to pay back the $6,500 plus attorney fees, plus interest, plus punitive damages. In the end, the total he was ordered to pay back was $19,000. At that time, Robert was on probation for a previous charge related to a stolen gift card, and a warrant had already been taken out for his arrest in August of 2006 for probation violations. But he was never arrested. His PO would eventually resign after they learned Robert hadn't really been supervised pretty much at all. Though Robert had found a full-time job in clinical research, he hadn't given up on preaching. Based on everyone who ever worked with him, he was a talented speaker who knew the Bible backwards and forwards. He could have deep discussions on doctrine, and he was well respected by those who didn't know he was also repeatedly committing crimes that aren't exactly biblical. Robert ended up starting a small evangelical church with a few members located in a strip mall in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And when Robert's name first came up to Latrese's family, they thought maybe she knew him through his church because she was dealing with questions of faith and God. But that's because they didn't know she was also struggling with her marriage and they didn't know about Stephen Randolph. Stephen and Robert were a bit of an odd couple as far as roommates go, being about 20 years apart in age and very different in personality. They had met in the spring of 2007 at some point, and Robert asked Stephen what he did for work. Stephen was trying to juggle school and basketball while working a job that would pay enough for his living expenses. So he mentioned to Robert that he was actually looking for something that was flexible and paid well. Robert told Stephen about how he was a research associate and had a job for him if he wanted it. This would have been after Robert was fired from his previous job, so it's unclear what he was actually doing. The two met up again at the mall to discuss the job, and during this time, Stephen was about to be evicted from his apartment because he couldn't afford it. He ended up couch surfing with friends for a while until Robert offered that he could come live with him. He could have the basement space as a little apartment for just $300 a month, and he could also help Robert out here and there around his school schedule. Robert did need some help with physical tasks because his left arm had been severely injured when he lived in New York. According to Robert, he was stabbed in a mugging and it left his left arm partially paralyzed. It was mostly affecting things like his grip. So Stephen thought this was a great setup. He'd have a bit of a job while also getting a huge discount on rent. A few weeks after Stephen moved in, Latrese came over to hang out with him and the two slept together. After she left, Robert asked him if he had sex with Latrese and Stephen said yes. Robert then turned the conversation to ask if Stephen had ever heard about male escort services. Now, I'm specifically using the words male escort because those are the words Robert used, and we're going to see a pattern. Stephen told Robert all he knew was what he learned from the movie Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo, and for those unacquainted with that particular cinematic masterpiece, it's about a man who, through a series of unfortunate events, ended up working as a male escort to raise money quickly. It has all of the humor an edgy 14-year-old would want. In that movie, though, the gigolos only have female clients, so Robert mentioned to Stephen that there would be a 1% chance that he would run into a male client. This is not a statistically accurate number, but it didn't matter because that's not really what Robert was asking. This was Robert seeing if Stephen had room for an encounter with a man in his world. Stephen said that if he got a male client, it would stop right there because he was straight. So that angle didn't really get Robert down the path he wanted, so he pivoted. He asked Stephen if he had ever measured himself, and he said no. So Stephen went into the other room and measured his penis. He was still under the impression that this was all in the context of them talking about the possibility of him being a male escort to women. After he came back in the room, Robert said it was important to make sure that he was clear of sexually transmitted infections, and he asked to visually examine Stephen's penis, which then happened. Robert then kept pushing the conversation, asking if Stephen was into any freaky stuff. He gave some examples, including golden showers. Stephen said he wasn't into anything other than the usual stuff, and then Robert told a story about how he was in college and another man performed oral sex on him, and then he suggested Stephen go upstairs and shower after having had sex with Latrese. It's at this point that Stephen started to catch on to what was happening here. And we can see this pattern with what the teens in New York said about Robert. He would bring up a sexual conversation, and then he would push to find their comfort limits, talking about them getting paid to have sex, talking about measuring penises, and so on. This whole thing was a repeat of something Robert had done before. Robert claimed that those were just lies coming out of a contentious divorce, but here we are, years later and 500 miles away, and the same allegations are coming back up with someone else. Stephen realized that Robert was trying to get him comfortable with the idea of oral sex with a man, and when he suggested that Stephen wash himself, he realized it was just one more step closer. So Stephen ended up just leaving the house entirely that night. He was too uncomfortable to be there, and he started wondering about Robert and his motives. He first went to a friend's house, and then he went to his cousin's house. His cousin gave him a handgun to keep in his room in case Robert tried anything forceful on him. When asked later why he felt threatened by Robert, Stephen said it was because Robert was a bishop in a church that believed homosexuality was a sin, and he was trying to push Stephen into a sexual encounter. And I thought this was interesting, and I've been thinking about it a little bit. Stephen didn't know about Robert's past, so he didn't know that Robert was a predator. He just thought this was a gay man coming on to him, so it really came across as homophobic to me at first. But then I realized that Stephen didn't say it's because he was gay or because he came on to me. He said it was because he was a hypocrite about it, and that made Stephen concerned about what else Robert would do. And then I wondered if perhaps there was something unspoken that Stephen couldn't quite put into words that made him recognize Robert for who he was. That feeling of being unsafe, that feeling that there's an undercurrent, maybe of violence that you can't quite figure out within the dynamic. I imagine that's a feeling that some of you have had in situations where you feel like you are in danger, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. And when what you're feeling are vague feelings, you don't necessarily think you're in immediate danger. And that's definitely how Stephen felt. He did return to the house and he told Robert that there was never going to be anything sexual between them, and Robert apologized. After that, Robert did try to bring up sex a couple more times to Stephen, one time saying that oral sex from a man doesn't make you gay because how is it any different than a woman doing it? There was an insinuation at one point that Stephen's rent would be forgiven in exchange for an encounter like that, but Stephen turned him down and Robert backed off each time. So what does any of this have to do with Latrese? Well, the motive they were exploring was if this was a case of jealousy. Even as Robert seemed to back down when Stephen rejected his advances, were Robert's unrequited feelings towards Stephen stronger than Stephen thought? The theory was that Robert claimed to go to church that night, but instead parked nearby and waited on Latrese to leave. The evidence he didn't go to church was that no one, not even his sister, saw him there. When Latrese left at 10, Robert followed her. We don't know where Latrese went or where she stopped along the way, but she was definitely taking her time getting home. At around midnight, she was on the phone talking to Stephen about their relationship, and she had only made it about 30 minutes from Stephen's house based on the cell tower records. At some point, Latrese pulled her car over. Maybe she was talking on the phone, maybe she was going to try to get the condom out again, or maybe she was forced off the road by Robert in his minivan. One theory is that as she was parked on the side of the road, Robert forced the driver's door open and started attacking her, possibly first striking her on the head. She did have a mark on her head like she was hit, not hurt enough to be knocked out, but maybe enough to be stunned. Another theory was that Robert got into her car, but why would she let this man, a virtual stranger, in the car with her? We can only speculate. One thought is that maybe he offered her counseling as a bishop, seeing as she had been with Stephen while being married. Another is that he just opened the door and forced his way in. Based on the amount of blood in her car and a clump of hair that was found in there, it's safe to say that at least some of the attack occurred while she was in the car. Robert then dragged her, so the police theory goes, attempting to get her into the woods. But the woods were up a bit of an embankment, and he just could not get her that far. When the trooper pulled behind the minivan at around 1:30, Robert was likely in the process of getting rid of evidence. After the trooper cleared the scene and left, Robert then got into his minivan and headed home, getting there at 2:33, which is when he found out that someone had armed the alarm system. He quickly disarmed it using the master code, which is a code only he used. 5 witnesses from that night would eventually come forward. They had all been driving down I-540 in those early hours. At first, the statements were that the minivan and Latrese's car were oddly close to each other, and then later the vehicles were seen on opposite sides of the highway, which is where they were when the trooper saw them. So somewhere in this whole attack, they believe Robert moved his vehicle so it would not be seen near Latrese's. With what the investigators had that was pointing to Robert, it wasn't really hard to get a search warrant to search the home he shared with Stephen. And during the search on the back deck of the house, they found a plastic trash can that was partially melted. Under it was one of those one-use foil turkey pans, and when they tested it, they found that there was an accelerant used and there was burned fabric in the pan. The only distinguishable part of the fabric that was left looked like some ribbing from a sock. Someone had burned clothes out there, and a clue as to who it was found in the house. There was a receipt in Robert's room from the 30th, which is the day Latrese's body was found, for the purchase of that pan. There is another reason to believe Robert bought the pan beyond that the receipt was in his room. It was bought at a time that Stephen could be confirmed to be at school and Robert's sister was at work. Also, the alarm system was disarmed with the master code, which again is Robert's code, within the time frame that made sense for someone to go to the store, buy the pan, and come home. So, as I was working on the research for this episode, I thought that the motive sounded more than a little weak. It wasn't like Robert and Stephen had a relationship and Latrese was in competition for his affections. Robert wasn't, according to Stephen, actively pursuing him. After the initial incident, they seemed to mostly move on, with Robert only bringing it up a couple more times. So why would Robert act out against a woman Stephen was seeing? What I didn't realize at that point in my research was that this did not look like the first time Robert had acted out against Stephen and the women he was dating. Stephen was at this time actually dating someone else, Velma, the person whose house he went to after Latrese left. If Stephen wasn't in class, he was almost always at Velma's place, as it was kind of the hangout spot for their group of friends. In late October 2007, Velma started getting some threatening calls from a private number. The calls were threats against Stephen, telling her to make sure her boyfriend stopped doing whatever he was doing, or he'd break his legs, ending his basketball career. Stephen also got similar calls, including one from someone who said he hoped Stephen had a gun. Now, that call came the same day Stephen realized the gun he kept in his room was missing. It turned out Robert had been in his room, found the gun, and took it. It seemed like interesting timing that Stephen got that call about having a gun on the exact day Robert had confiscated it, But Stephen didn't know Robert was the one who had taken the gun at the time, so he didn't immediately connect the call with Robert. And he knew it wasn't Robert's voice on the call. Whoever called him sounded younger. Then on December 11th, 2007, Stephen went to get in his car to go to Velma's house, but he realized he had a flat tire. He was able to get to the gas station to fill it, and then he went to Velma's. While there, he got more calls from a blocked number, but he didn't answer them. When he went to leave Velma's house, he found that all 4 of his tires had been slashed. Robert called him that night saying that someone had been ringing the doorbell and running off. Stephen felt like he was being targeted and he didn't want to go home, so he spent the night at Velma's, even though Robert seemed to want him to come home. The next day, Robert paid to have Stephen's car towed back to the house, but Stephen didn't have any money to get all 4 tires replaced right away. Robert was open to paying for it, but Stephen wasn't comfortable after he had already covered the towing expense. So instead, he borrowed Robert's minivan for the last few days of class before he went home to Baltimore for his winter break, and he was able to get the tires fixed when he returned in January. While Stephen was in Baltimore, Velma got a call on December 17th that she recorded, and it was from a man that said he had slashed her tires and he was sorry. Velma went out to check on her car, and her tires had, in fact, been slashed. The investigators believed that Robert was behind this, trying to cause issues for Stephen and Velma, and they believed it because of the cell phone records. Robert had 3 phone lines. He had his landline, he had his regular cell phone, and then he had a second cell phone that the police learned was in his name, but he had not initially told the investigators about it. This phone was for private and personal things. Again, this is a mostly closeted gay man, not just a gay man, but a gay bishop. So he had a second phone that was referred to as his fun phone. On December 1st, the fun phone called Velma 6 times and Stephen once, all while blocking the number from caller ID. On December 11th, the day of Stephen's slashed tires, 7 calls were made to Stephen's phone, all with a blocked number. And on the day Velma's tires were slashed, 2 calls were made to her from that phone. It seemed clear Robert was making the calls or getting someone to make them for him using his phone. Now, slashed tires and threatening calls aren't the same as murder, but it showed Robert did try to interfere with Stephen's relationship with one woman, and maybe he would do it with another. And maybe he didn't initially intend to kill Latrese that night. Maybe he was just going to follow her home and slash her tires. But then she pulled over and he decided to approach her car. Or maybe he changed his mind and decided to force her off the road. According to Robert, he did none of these things. He pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder and went to trial in September of 2009. He had an excellent attorney. I'm not a legal expert, but I do see a lot of cases. The major source for this episode was the trial, which is available online. So I've seen a lot of attorneys in action, and this is the kind of attorney you want in your corner as a defendant. For one thing, he was thorough. He found an issue with the search warrant for Robert's house and got everything there kicked out. So the receipt, the burned clothes, and computer info that showed Robert was familiar with the area Latrese was found, even though he told the police he wasn't, all of that was kicked out. And he did a good job arguing why 2 witnesses should be excluded. Now, they weren't excluded in spite of his best attempts, but the jury was given strict instructions on the scope of that testimony. These witnesses were 2 other men who had stories about Robert's advances. The first witness, a man named LeQuinton, testified that he was working at the South Point Mall in 2005 when Robert approached his kiosk. They were talking, and eventually Robert offered to drive LeQuinton home, which he welcomed since he normally took the bus, which took forever to go just 20 miles. As they were driving, LeQuinton said that the conversation ended up being kind of a locker room guy talk, including talk about women and sex. When he dropped LeQuinton off, Robert asked how much he paid in rent, and LeQuinton said it wasn't really much, just about $100 for his room. Robert offered LaQuinton a room for free, but remember they literally just met that day, so obviously LaQuinton turned him down. But over the next little bit, Robert would show up at the mall and talk with LaQuinton, and Robert made the offer for him to live with them again, which LaQuinton eventually took him up on because the place he was staying was not working out. Not long after moving in, Robert was heading out of town, so LaQuinton was going to house sit and take care of Robert's dog while he was gone. LaQuinton, with the house to himself, had his girlfriend over without telling Robert. Robert found out, though, because he saw condoms in the trash, and he asked LaQuinton if he had anyone over. LaQuinton lied and said he hadn't, and Robert asked, "Then why do you have condoms?" Robert was not happy that LaQuinton had his girlfriend over, which wasn't immediately a red flag for LaQuinton because it was Robert's house, and maybe he didn't want strangers over without his knowledge, particularly when he was out of town. But then we start seeing a pattern that we have seen before. Robert had already built in the comfort talking about sex the first time they spoke. And after a few weeks of living with Robert, LaQuinton got the "Have you ever thought of being a male escort?" line. Again, same exact wording. And then Robert went into the oral sex isn't any different from a man than a woman, and that's when LaQuinton realized what was happening. LaQuinton left the room at this point, feeling very unsure about what to do next. He had been staying there for free, and now he was being, in his view, propositioned for sex. And if he had any doubts if those two things were connected, those doubts were erased when Robert told him that rent actually wasn't free. He now owed him money. So, the rent was free until LaQuinton turned him down for sex. If that wasn't bad enough, the next day LaQuinton was arrested at work after Robert called the police to report destruction of property. The charges would later be dropped, but the point of this testimony was to show that Robert retaliated when he was turned down. The other man who testified was a security system installation tech named John. He had been to Robert's house in October of 2007 when he was considering getting the alarm system installed. John arrived at 8 a.m. and Robert was wearing a suit. About 15 minutes later, Stephen left for class and Robert changed into shorts and an undershirt and began the pattern that we have learned so well. He started with the locker room type talk about sex. He then said John had good features and would do well as a male escort. I'm sure you can already guess that he then asked about John's penis size and asked if he would ever have a sexual encounter with a man. This guy was there to assess the price for installing a home security system, and he was being sexually harassed. He told Robert that he had to be elsewhere and went to shake Robert's hand like the end of a professional interaction. He testified that when he offered his hand, Robert then grabbed him by the wrist and started pulling him farther into the house in the direction of the bathroom. Robert then told John to just let him do what he had to do and he'd give him some money afterwards. John got himself loose from Robert's grip and took off out the door, leaving all of his paperwork and some of his stuff behind. The purpose of this testimony wasn't just the pattern of behavior, but also that Robert pulled this full-grown man into the house with one hand. And it's important because that would be a defense argument. Robert couldn't have dragged and stabbed Latrese because his left arm was nearly useless. But here he is dragging a full-grown man who is actively trying to get away. The defense did try to get the parts of John's testimony about the sexual harassment excluded, even if the physical force part was allowed in. They were worried that homophobia would influence the jury, but beyond that, Robert's predatory behavior would absolutely prejudice them against him. I mean, it prejudices me against him, and I imagine if I was on that jury, I would have to work pretty hard to separate that from the actual charges against him. The judge, however, decided that he had to allow the lead up in. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense to the jury on why Robert was pulling this alarm system tech towards the bathroom. but the jury was only supposed to consider it as far as physical ability went. Another major piece of evidence we haven't gone over was some DNA that was found on the steering wheel of Latrese's car. The sample was a mixture of Latrese's DNA and a male of African descent. It was only a partial DNA profile, so they could only exclude and include people, not match them. Darren Curtis and Stephen Randolph were excluded as contributors, and Robert was included as a possible contributor. According to the testimony, the chances the DNA came from a black man other than Robert were 1 in 147,000. There is one thing that came up in the trial that seems odd to me, and that was that a knife and a screwdriver were found in the back of Robert's vehicle. The odd thing isn't that they were found, it's that they were both found 9 months after his arrest when there was another search of his minivan. But neither tested positive for blood, and it's not clear if either were the murder weapon. The defense hinted that they were planted there, but if they were planted, I don't know why they wouldn't have made sure some DNA or blood ended up on them. I mean, if Robert burned his clothes, he almost surely got rid of the murder weapon. At most, it showed that Robert sometimes carried things capable of stabbing people with. We've gotten into the major points of the state's case here, and let's go ahead and get into the defense. Like I said, this was a pretty good defense. This attorney was on it. First, they had an alternative suspect, and that was Stephen Randolph. They didn't just suggest it, they outright blamed him for killing Latrese. When Stephen testified, any inconsistency in his testimony from his statements to the police were brought up. He said he had sex with Latrese twice from the stand, but he had told the police they had sex 3 times, so that was challenged. In one written police report, it said that Stephen said he left Velma's house about 15 minutes after the last phone call with Latrese, which completely changed his timeline if true. It would give him time to go home, get Robert's van, and be at the murder scene by 1:30. Stephen testified that this was not true, and it was not what he said to the police. He did have someone back up that he didn't leave Velma's house until 1:20-ish, but that was a friend of his, and friends will alibi each other sometimes. And the other proof that Stephen got home was that the home alarm was armed at 1:28, which aligned with his story, but arming an alarm can be done by anyone, and it's not done by code, so how do we know it was Stephen? Was it possible that Robert had gotten up and realized the alarm was off, so he armed it? That's what the defense said happened. The defense also pointed out the odd timeline. If Latrese left at 10 p.m., Robert would have been following her around for 2 to 3 hours or more. And we know he had to have been following her because there was no other way he could have known where she was otherwise. They had absolutely no contact with each other. It's not like there was a call between the two of them, and he could have gone to meet her on the side of the highway. But there was someone who Latrese did talk to on the phone that night, and it was someone who would have gone to meet her on the side of the highway, and that was Stephen. They had just had that issue with the condom, which would make anyone worried about pregnancy, and Latrese was talking about pursuing a more serious relationship. Instead of saying, "We can talk about this later," like Stephen told the police he said, maybe he said, "Let's talk about this now," and he drove out to where Latrese was using Robert's van. Latrese's wedding rings were found in the car, so maybe she took them off to show Stephen she was serious, her marriage was over. Then the talking turned into arguing, and Stephen saw the future he hoped he had in the NBA derailed. Enraged, he attacked. Didn't that make more sense, Robert's attorney argued, than Latrese and Robert in some caravan of driving around for hours? Didn't it make more sense that a college athlete would be able to overpower a physically fit woman and drag her back to the woods rather than a man with one bad arm? No, as for the motive, the defense basically had to throw their hands up and concede that Robert Reeves preyed on young men. They compared him to a straight man who does the same thing to young women. Instead of chasing skirts, he was chasing pants. And those were the attorney's words, not mine. But the attorney used this to his advantage in his argument. Because Robert was always on the lookout for the next guy, he didn't really have any attachment or intimacy with Stephen. He didn't actively pursue him after Stephen told him he wasn't interested. He certainly didn't care enough to threaten him, harass Velma, or kill Latrese. As for the scratches, Robert got those when he and Stephen moved furniture in the house, and the DNA was such a small amount, a partial profile, that it could have been transfer. When Latrese went to the bathroom to try to get the condom out, she used the half bath on the main floor that everyone in the house used. She could have gotten some of Robert's DNA on her and transferred it to the steering wheel. If it was Robert's DNA at all, again, that wasn't conclusive. As for the alarm at 2:33 a.m., which was disarmed by Robert using his master code, the defense said yes, it was Robert who did that. But he wasn't coming into the house. He was already inside. The door was opened and the alarm was disarmed in 4 seconds. It would make more sense, according to the defense, that he was pretty close to the keypad to be able to punch in the number that quickly. They said that he had opened the door from the inside to let his dog out. 10 minutes later, the alarm was armed again, which is in line with a dog going outside to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. But the attorney in his closing mentioned that 16 minutes later, Robert disarmed the alarm again, and then 2 minutes later, it was set again. And he doesn't really explain this other than to say that Robert told the police he went to bed around 11:30 and was up and down all night with things like turning off lights and dealing with the dog. Maybe the dog went out again, but surely the state was thinking he was running out to his van to get rid of evidence. The defense argued that the only reason the evidence pointed more towards Robert than towards Stephen is because that's all the police were looking for. After they narrowed in on Robert within days, they decided not to request the cell phone records for Stephen to prove that he, or at least his phone, was where he said he was. By the time the defense came on board and wanted those records, more than 90 days had passed and the information was gone. Beyond that, they pointed out that it was Stephen who had a knife and sword collection. Were any weapons missing? Maybe. We don't know. The police asked Stephen how many items were in his collection, and then they counted them, and they were the same number. But Stephen could have very easily lied and said he had one less than he had before the murder. There was no independent accounting of his collection. Of course, the defense didn't really have to prove Stephen Randolph did it. That was not their job. The state had to prove that Robert Reeves was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the defense argued that Stephen Randolph provided beyond a reasonable doubt, and he was actually evidence of Robert's innocence. When the jury took the case to deliberate, they really focused on that timeline. Logic dictates that the killer had access to the minivan, so that gives us Robert and Stephen as our suspects. Did Robert really drive around following Latrese for hours before killing her? Or did Stephen somehow drive out to where she was, kill her, and get back home without setting off the alarm or disarming it? So the house alarm was armed from 1:28 until 2:33, so it couldn't have been in that window. Robert said he was up letting the dog out for the next 10 minutes, and he did not mention Stephen coming home. And then it was armed again from 2:43 until just about 3 a.m. It was then only disarmed by Robert briefly. Again, he did not report that Stephen came in at that time. Then no one disarmed the alarm until people started leaving for the day around 8 a.m. So how did Stephen get back into the house where Robert and Willa Mae said he was in the morning without ever disarming the alarm? It only made sense that he came home before the alarm was set for the night. And the only time that could have been was 1:28 or earlier, just like he said. So that left the jury with only Robert Reeves. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict, the judge did something he had never done before. He allowed the prosecution to tell the jury about the suppressed evidence. He thought it was only fair that the jury walk out of the courtroom with all of the knowledge on the case. And that's when they learned about the burned clothing and the disposable pan that Robert had bought. They also learned that there was a young man who accused Robert of rape in the past who was too afraid to testify. Robert Reeves is serving a life without parole sentence, and his appeals have been denied. In this case, I think the evidence points towards Robert Reeves' guilt. It's a good thing motive doesn't have to be proven to prove a case, because this motive seems flimsy to me. Latrese had a little to do with Robert and probably never thought twice about him. And that really only compounds the tragedy. As Latrese's father told the media after the verdict, Latrese would have died just so confused, with no idea why this man, who she barely knew, was attacking her. And part of me wonders if Robert Reeves even understands why he did it. He has the rest of his life in prison to try to figure it out. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.